Stephen P. Halbrook has been fighting this fight a long time. He is a senior fellow at the Independent Institute. He's taught legal and political philosophy at George Mason University, Howard University, and Tuskegee Institute. He specializes in constitutional cases and has argued and won firearm rights cases in the Supreme Court. He is the author of the books The Founders, Second Amendment, Gun Control in the Third Reich, Disarming the Jews and Enemies of the State, and Gun Control in Nazi-Occupied France. Stephen, are you there?
Yes, I am, Andrew. Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for coming on. I appreciate it. Let's go back to the beginning here. How did the Second Amendment come to be in the first place?
Well, it really goes back to the dawn of human history. As long as there are people, there will be some trying to dominate others. And so we have the opposing movement with the thumb in our hands, and technology was developed, including defensive weapons. And by the time we get up to America being created, the British had tried to disarm the Americans so that they could exploit them economically and rule them otherwise without any kind of representation. And so they tried to take their guns away so they could do all that. And the colonists fought back and decided, well, when they won the revolution, we're going to put it in our Constitution that you have a right to keep and bear arms. The Second Amendment states that a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And notice it says the people, just like in the First Amendment, the right of the people peaceably to assemble, or the Fourth Amendment, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, papers, houses, and effects from unreasonable searches and seizure. So we had this doctrine created in the mid-20th century that the people really means the National Guard, which really means the government, and so only the government authorized people have a right to bear arms. And that was not only put down when the Supreme Court decided the Heller case in 2008. I mean, what a ridiculous proposition that was. The people doesn't mean individuals, it means the state. I mean, the Second Amendment was created to protect the people from the state, from government.
You know, one of the arguments, I want to put forward the arguments that you hear on television, never mind the arguments you hear in a court of law, because the ones that come on television, the easy ones that flow out and make the widest impression on people. You know, one of the arguments they have as well, this militia system that they had was there to prevent a standing army. We now have a standing army. The militias no longer exist, so the right to bear arms is out of date. Does that have any kind of standing at all?
Well, no. By having an armed populace, if the right is respected, where people have a choice to keep and bear arms, you don't have to do it. You have at least the basis to have popular resistance to tyranny, and that would mean potentially a organization of a militia. I mean, even federal law today defines the unorganized militia as all able-bodied persons in a certain age group. So we really do have an unorganized or a reserve militia under current law. And it's been used in World War II when all the young men were conscripted, and you had to have some protection from sabotage and espionage, a lot of things like that. Law enforcement couldn't handle it all. So you had state protective forces that were formed by members of the local gun clubs and hunters. So the idea that somehow if there's no organized militia, that there's no right to keep and bear arms, that those propositions don't jive. Everybody remembers statements. It's going on in the present Democrat campaign about, well, we can confiscate guns and we'll even nuke you if that was Swalwell. We'll nuke you if you resist. I mean, that's not going to happen. And we have several devices in which the people have the ability to show their power, basically. And it's the ballot box, it's the jury box, and it's the cartridge box. So these are all ways that the people protect their sovereignty, and they're not obsolete.
What about the argument, and this is the one you hear all the time, that the poor founders and their limited intelligence could never have imagined that they would invent something stronger than the flintlock? That the weaponry that we have today is so advanced that no citizen actually needs it. Is there any legitimacy to that argument?
There's no basis to that any more than if we said that modern printing presses aren't protected or the internet's not protected by the free speech and press clauses of the First Amendment. And if you want to know the truth, back in those days, it's true that most firearms were single shot, but muskets had bayonets. And you could, just like they like to talk about, you want to kill as many people as quickly as possible. Well, a bayonet never gives out of ammo. You can keep bayoneting people as long as they keep coming at you. It's more of an offensive weapon than a defensive weapon, but modern firearms are simply the descendants of older firearms, and the Supreme Court held in Heller that they're protected just as much as modern technologies or the fact that we are protected in our Fourth Amendment rights in regard to uses of modern kinds of communication.
It's not really a surprise, is it, that the government, I mean, we were given, we were ensured the right to bear arms to protect ourselves from the government. It's not really that surprising that the government should be trying to take away our arms. I mean, why would the government want us to have arms, I guess? Is there any way, now we look at these shootings, and of course they break your heart. Obviously, these madmen walk into civilian places where nobody is armed and nobody can defend themselves. They kill children, they kill anybody in their way, and it just tears you apart to read the stories. We all want to do something. Is there any way, is there any kind of restriction on gun ownership that you feel is legitimate?
Oh, yeah. We've got a lot of laws on the books now. They're not always followed, but we've got laws particularly about violent felons, people who've been committed to mental institutions. I mean, you can go down the list and it keeps expanding. But what we've got in this country is another problem that I'm not sure how to handle it. It certainly can't be handled by gun control efforts, and that would be the fact that we've got these poisonous ideologies, these crypto-fascist and communist kinds of ideologies that are driving people to hatred. Just like last weekend, we have racism, a guy who combined racism with all kinds of environmental New Deal stuff. And then we have the other guy who turns out to be a supporter of, I forgot which Democrat candidate, I think Elizabeth Warren, hated people on the right. So we've got these ideologies, and we have people, including in Congress, beating the drums, calling for violence against their political opponents. Mm-hmm. I mean, this kind of stuff has got to stop. We also have a lot of mental illness in this country that drives some of this, and that's least paid attention to. We've got to, it's hard to get anybody committed because of all the civil liberties they now have. But if you turn the clock back, there used to be a way to do that. They want to pass these red flag laws where they say, well, if somebody's a danger to themselves or others, we should take the guns away. Well, no, we should take those people in for mental treatment.
Mm. So in other words, I was going to ask you about that. The red flag laws, do you feel there's any legitimacy to those? In other words, what you're saying is if you're that mentally ill, it's not about the guns, it's about your freedom and about your wandering around, able to hurt yourself and others anyway.
Right, and the tools are there; they're unlimited. If you look at the way arson has been used by mass killers in this country, that far exceeds anybody killed with guns in specific incidents. There's just a lot of ways to do people harm, and there's all kinds of substitutes that you can use. So, we had the Oklahoma City bombing. I mean, 9/11. I mean, it's unlimited, the evil that mankind can do to other mankind. So what we've got to look at is how do we get these people off the streets? Some of them need help. Some of them need just incarceration or maybe the death penalty. But and these gun-free zones, who got that idea that you could disarm everybody and put a sign up and bad guys are going to stay away?
Recently during the riots in Venezuela, somebody on TV, presumably a left-wing journalist, commented that the populace was unarmed in Venezuela and had no way to defend itself. You've written a lot about this in history and in Nazi Germany. There is a lot of history of people being disarmed and thereby falling under tyranny. Is that fair to say?
Right. I mean, back in the 20s, in Germany, they had the same debates on gun control that we have now. And the idea was that, well, you could cause registration of gun owners, and you could do other things like, not let people have certain kinds of firearms, and that would somehow solve the violence that was going on in the streets. And they did pass gun registration, and they said, well, don't let these records fall into the wrong hands of extremists. And just less than 2 years after that was said, the Nazis took over, and they used the gun registration list to disarm all of their political opponents, including the very people who had gotten these laws passed in the first place. A lot of them were social democrats, and they went down the list, and they knew who was who, and you weren't politically reliable, you were disarmed. And then we get up to Reich Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass, and they disarm all the Jews, and they had their registration records. And when they invaded other countries, it's the same story. It's the death penalty to possess a gun, and they used the registration list to disarm a lot of people. And a lot of people didn't turn their arms in, and so a lot were executed, but they also were able to resist. There's an entire history that's really only come to the surface. You mentioned two of my books, Gun Control and the Third Reich, Disarming the Jews and Enemies of the State, and Gun Control in Nazi-occupied France. They tell the whole story, but it's a universal story. I mean, it happens all over the world in every age, and you have a pendulum of prohibiting populations who want to protect themselves from having weapons so you can manipulate and oppress them, or if you want to do a genocide, then that's possible too. But if you have a free society, this right's respected just like other rights.
Stephen P. Halbrook, thank you so much. I wish I could talk to you more. I'm running out of time, but I hope I can talk to you again. Really interesting, and I appreciate it very much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you for having me. Take care.